My name is Saloni Dattani. If you haven't met me already, I'm one of the co-founders of Works in Progress, and I'm a researcher at Our World in Data. I thought I'd pitch a really ambitious title, and then I realized I actually have to put together the slides. This is I think, really big topic, and there's no way that I can really cover the whole thing. So what I wanted to do instead was focus on a few really clear examples where I think we could easily speed up medical breakthroughs with existing tools and ideas, and we just need to kind of work on it. But I want to kind of give you this appreciation for how many different ways there are to tackle this problem and also why it matters. I'm one of the co-founders, editors, and the data visualizer on Works in Progress, and I'm also a researcher at Our World in Data, where I focus on global health and medicine. So you've probably heard of some of these ideas, either from other people or maybe you've thought them yourself. When breakthroughs don't happen, it's because things are too scientifically complicated. Or scientific breakthroughs only happen when they're ready to, when there's the basic research and tools to make them happen. Cutting corners is the only way to speed up science. Speed is at its optimum, or worse, there's so much bad research being churned out that we should slow it down. I want to give you a different perspective on this idea. And to do that, I'm going to start by talking about the malaria vaccine. So in case you didn't know, there are now malaria vaccines. There are two vaccines, and the first one was first recommended and approved in 2021. This is an incredible achievement because malaria is a disease that kills more than 500,000 people each year. Most of them are children, and most of them live in Africa. Another reason it's a big achievement is because it's the first vaccine against a parasitic disease that affects humans. So as you can see in this chart, which shows the year when each new vaccine was first introduced, malaria is the first one that's blue. It's the first disease vaccine for a parasite. Now, parasites are more difficult to develop vaccines for because they're bigger than viruses and bacteria, and because they're kind of shapeshifters. They change their conformation over their life cycle, and that makes it really difficult for our immune system to recognize them and develop antibodies and immunity against them. This is a great advance, but I also think it's a failure. And the reason is this. The malaria vaccine was recommended in 2021, but it was first developed in the 1980s, and it was first tested in human trials in 1997. That's an enormous gap of more than 24 years. And when I first found out about this, I was like, what the heck happened here? I want to understand exactly why it took so long. Could we have gotten it sooner? And I wrote this piece with two economists, Rachel Glenister and Siddhartha Harya, called Why We Didn't Get a Malaria Vaccine Sooner, that traced the journey of the malaria vaccine since ancient history. So you could start this process at any point in this timeline, but I'm going to just focus in on these last few decades. So here you can see when this mouse model for malaria was first discovered in the 1960s. In the 1980s, GSK developed a bunch of candidate vaccines that could work in trials. In 1997, they first started the first field trial of 300 people in Ghana. And then they found it seemed relatively successful, which was very different from all of the other candidate vaccines at the time. They put together some funding to start phase 1 and 2 trials. These are the initial stages of clinical testing where you're looking for safety and some basic understanding of whether the vaccines are effective. Those phase 1 and 2 trials lasted for 7 years. It was very difficult for the researchers to put together these trials because sites to actually test out the vaccine were not in place in Africa. They had to set up those sites themselves. They had to put together funding for scaling it up. They finally completed the trials in 2009. They got good results. They decided to move on to phase 3 trials. Those took another 5 years. They finally put together the results from those studies. They submitted it to the European Medicines Agency, which is Europe's alternative to the FDA. The EMA said it looked safe, it looked effective. They gave a positive opinion to it, And then the World Health Organization said, this is not enough. We think that there's a possibility that the vaccine increases the risk of meningitis in children. And we don't actually think it's related to the vaccine. The data doesn't seem to be that clear, but we want to rule it out. And so they asked for further studies to be done. At that point, the existing funding then got withdrawn. And then the researchers had to put together new funding. They spent 4 years getting funding and setup started, and then they launched the next pilot studies in 2019. Those then took another 2 years, and they got the results from them, which showed there was no increase in the risk of meningitis. So it was finally endorsed in 2021, 23 years after it was first developed. Now, I think this is not just an abstract problem. This is a disease that kills more than 500,000 people a year, so we should really care about the speed of this development and what went wrong here. And you might be wondering, well, if it kills so many people, why did we not treat this as an urgent problem? And I think the reason is because it mostly affects the global poor. So people most affected by malaria live in Africa, in the poorest regions where health expenditure is very low. So on average, someone in sub-Saharan Africa spends about $73 per person per year on healthcare. That's 1/80th of what's spent in the average high-income country. When the amount of funding for a disease that primarily affects the global poor is so small, pharmaceutical companies can't put the investment in these long-term clinical trial studies, but they also don't have a financial market once they've developed the drug or vaccine. Because of this, most funding for malaria comes from public or philanthropic sources, as you can see here. And the usual way that this happens is through what are called push mechanisms. So funders try to find research groups that they think might succeed at developing a vaccine, and they provide research funding directly to them. Now, this can be difficult. Funders don't always have good knowledge of who is going to succeed or which vaccines will be effective. And the researchers themselves might try to hype it up. They might try to downplay other research groups. And people who finally develop the vaccines then have very little incentive to scale up in the countries that, in poor countries, even once a vaccine is developed. The usual way that we deal with this problem is through patents. So patents are a monopoly on selling the product, and they're useful when the returns to this innovation can be internalized by the firm. So the firm with vaccines usually recovers R&D costs by charging high prices in wealthy countries, and then after the patents expire or after they license it to other generic producing companies, then there might be increasing wider use. The problem is this doesn't affect wealthy countries. It primarily affects people in Africa. So there isn't an incentive for pharmaceutical companies to develop it without any funding. So the alternative to doing patents or top-down funding are some other ideas. So there could be advanced market commitments, and I'm going to start by talking about them. So advanced market commitments are what's called a pull funding mechanism. They're a promise to buy products at a certain quantity at a certain price if the technology is approved, if it meets certain criteria. So in the case of vaccines, it might need to have some minimum threshold of safety and efficacy. And then there's this pool of funding that's available for pharmaceutical companies to develop it, but also to be reimbursed based on how many doses they produce. They also receive a co-payment by the countries who receive the vaccines. And this ensures that this is a product that the countries actually want to use. This is very useful because not only does it encourage development, it also encourages manufacturers to scale up the product once it's developed. So we've already tried this in the past. In fact, the first advanced market commitment, the idea behind it was developed by Michael Kramer and Rachel Glenister for malaria vaccines. And that didn't happen because people thought that it was a far-fetched idea and there wasn't a chance of a malaria vaccine succeeding. So instead, there was an advanced market commitment developed for pneumococcal vaccines. Pneumococcus is a respiratory infection that used to cause about 700,000 deaths a year. And 7 countries and the Gates Foundation came together to fund a $1.5 billion AMC to develop pneumococcal vaccines. This succeeded. Within a few years, pharmaceutical companies got their pneumococcal vaccines through trials. They had already developed some for strains that affected rich countries, but they hadn't developed them for the strains that affected the poor. And it's estimated that 700,000 lives were saved by this vaccination by 2021. It was an extremely cost-effective initiative which cost about $83 per daily averted. So I talked about malaria, and what's surprising about malaria is that even though this was such a difficult problem and difficult disease to get funding for, there are various other diseases that have much less funding than that. So trachoma is one example, which is right at the bottom of this list. Trachoma is a bacterial eye infection that can cause blindness, and it's one of the most common causes of blindness worldwide. There's snakebite envenoming. So snakebite kills about 100,000 people a year, mostly in India and Africa. And the way that we usually treat snakebite is with antivenom that is developed by literally injecting snake venom into horses and sheep and extracting the antibodies from their blood. This is a 100-year-old technique, and we don't have synthetic antibodies to replace it. Because of this limited amount of funding, there are lots of diseases where the pipeline of candidate drugs and vaccines is very limited. So for trachoma, for example, there are only 4 vaccines in the pipeline at all, and they're all in very early stage trials. For all of these other diseases as well, there's very little incentive to develop drugs that could work. So I talked about one idea of advanced market commitments, and I think that they're an example of where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit of new developments that we can make. And some of the ideas, some of the areas where this could be applied are neglected tropical diseases like the ones I just showed, rare diseases, so where each individual disease is quite rare, but in total about 4 to 7% of the population suffers from a rare disease, and it's difficult to find a financial market to develop a drug for any one of these rare diseases. There are also potential pandemic pathogens, where the consequences of the pandemic pathogen haven't actually emerged yet, and so there's no market yet for the drug to be developed. So I talked about the advanced market commitments and the problems with funding, but of course, if you look back at this timeline, you might think, well, there's so many other things that we could have improved. Maybe the World Health Organization shouldn't have called for more pilot studies. Maybe they should have just agreed. And also, why did it take 7 years to run these phase 1 and 2 trials? So I think this is another example where we could have sped up this development. Now, in case you didn't know, so vaccines typically spend about a decade in trials before they're approved. I think this is quite scary to think about because we've already developed these vaccines at the start, and now we spend 10 years trying to test them before people can actually receive them. Of course, you might be aware that this is not what happened during the pandemic. We, in fact, got a vaccine within a year. And I think this was quite unexpected to a lot of people, and I think in hindsight, you might say, well, we didn't see that coming. It wasn't obvious. Maybe we were just really lucky. I'm going to give myself a bit of credit here by saying that I made this prediction that it would actually be available by the end of 2020. And the reason was that there were a lot of things going right for these vaccines. So first, there was a lot of urgency on tackling this problem. There was a lot of upfront funding through Operation Warp Speed. There was also existing research on coronaviruses. And in fact, there were already coronavirus vaccines available for animal diseases. We also had a proof of concept. We knew that a lot of people could clear the infection if they got infected, and we could think that maybe we could do the same thing by priming them with a vaccine. There was lots of interest in running clinical trials and for people to participate in those trials. It was easy to recruit tens of thousands of participants into clinical trials around the world. Another reason was because the disease was actually so widespread. It would be easy to test the effect of a vaccine if there was one, because the disease was so widespread. And the final reason that I want to focus on now is parallelization. So the clinical trial phase usually goes in these sequential ordering. So we have preclinical research that goes on in the labs with animals. Then we move on to phase 1, which is about dozens of participants. In humans, we test some of the safety features of the vaccine. We then move on to phase 2 with hundreds of participants just to test additional safety parameters and look at the efficacy of the vaccines. And then we move on to phase 3, which are these large-scale trials with thousands of participants. Finally, after all of that, we look through all of the data and submit a report for regulatory agencies to approve. If you think about how long it usually takes for vaccines to be developed, my boss, Max Roser at Our World in Data, put together this chart that shows when each disease had its pathogen first discovered, and then how long it took to develop the vaccine for it. Some of these timelines are very long. So the malaria vaccine, for example, the Plasmodium parasite that causes the disease was discovered in 1880, but it took 141 years for the vaccine to be developed. In contrast, we have COVID-19, which took less than a year. And my argument is that a lot of these timelines could have been sped up. And I think that's quite a bold claim, but I really think it's possible. And I think it's important to actually consider this possibility seriously. One of the reasons that this really matters is because we know how effective the vaccines have been. It's estimated that about 20 million deaths were averted by COVID vaccination in just the first year. If those vaccines weren't available, a lot more people would have died. And the fact that these timelines were so sped up really made a difference. So can we develop other vaccines faster? If I go back through that list of all the reasons that COVID-19 vaccines were produced so fast, I think we can apply some of those reasons and try to improve the speed of other vaccines too. So if funding was really important for COVID-19 vaccines, can we increase upfront funding through advanced market commitments for other diseases and other vaccines? If there was existing research on coronaviruses that mattered, can we fund preliminary research on pandemic diseases that we haven't faced yet, or neglected pathogens that don't have much R&D funding? Similarly, if we have a proof of concept from natural infection already, can we find out whether this is actually true for other diseases too? And how do we improve recruitment into trials? If recruitment was so important in clinical trials, how do we improve that? And finally, when there are diseases that are not widespread, what are we going to do in those scenarios? One example of tackling that problem is by running a challenge trial, in which you deliberately infect volunteers with a disease that they agree to, and then you can test out various parameters and test out the potential of drugs or vaccines against them. And that way you can prepare for diseases that are sporadic or haven't affected us in a pandemic situation already. Finally, can we make trials and the regulatory review process more efficient? In 2018, researchers at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations argued that it wouldn't be very costly to actually fund vaccines for these important diseases that don't face us yet. So they estimated that it would cost $1.2 to $8.7 billion to get at least one vaccine through phase 1 and 2 trials for 11 important diseases that could potentially cause pandemics. That is a very small amount compared to the expected benefit if any of them cause a pandemic. A third idea that I want to talk about are how to change the usual process of running trials. So in case you didn't know, the usual way that we test lots of drugs and vaccines is by comparing a single drug to a placebo or a control group, or a single drug versus another drug. And we run these trials separately, which means that we have to set up the costs of the trial and recruit participants in each trial separately. Another alternative to this that I think is very promising is a platform trial. So in a platform trial, you're not just comparing one to one, you're comparing one control group to 5 different drugs. Those drugs don't have to all be tested at the same time. We could start testing one of them at one time point and then wait for there to be enough research to suggest we should test another one and include those in the same trial. This is something that's already been tried. We have had big trials such as the COVID-19 recovery trial in the UK, which tested 10 drugs in a single trial within 2 years. The trial flexibly added new treatments into the same trial based on preliminary lab evidence, and it meant that we found out whether all of these 10 drugs were effective or not. And some of them really were, and we found out, for example, that dexamethasone was effective against COVID-19 within 4 months. A slightly different alternative to the same thing is called a multi-arm, multi-stage trial. Here you test out multiple drugs and then you have these interim times where you look at the results so far. Based on those interim results, you decide whether the drug should continue being studied or if it looks pretty hopeless. And that way you can kind of narrow down with more precision how effective the drug is. Now, these alternative clinical trials have already been used, and they're often used in infectious disease and cancer research, but they're quite rare in other fields, and they're also quite rare in general. There are only a few dozen trials that have been done through this structure so far, and most of them have been done in the UK and the US. I think there are several reasons that we don't have these much more commonly yet. One of the big reasons is a lack of statistical training. These trials are quite difficult to design. You have to work with Bayesian statisticians who know how to design these trials for each different drug and outcome. I think it would be also easier if we had these sort of shared platforms where you're testing drugs from different companies. And that's quite hard to do because you want to coordinate between these pharmaceutical companies that often have different interests. So what you would need to do to run a trial in this way is often to run the trial through a public or independent organization. And that's what happened during the recovery trial, for example, which ran through the NHS. And when you do that, you can develop a shared protocol for recruiting participants. You have a shared outcome where you're testing all of them against the same outcome. So I've now gone through a few different types of ways to speed up medical breakthroughs, focusing on low-hanging fruit with better incentives and market shaping, but also some clinical trial design reforms. But really what I think is that there are just so many different ways that you could tackle this problem. You could work on fundamental science breakthroughs. How do we change scientific funding models for research that takes a long time or that's unpredictable? Or how do we improve the academic publishing system? How do we speed up and improve peer review? How do we check for errors in fields that have a lot of scientific fraud? How do we improve the construction of labs or attract scientists to the area, or even improve energy and computational resources? What I've seen, I think, from the examples that I've looked at is that there are often multiple reasons that things go wrong, but also multiple ways that you could have sped up the same process. What I think based on this is that we should try out and experiment lots of different approaches to doing research. We should work on all of these different areas. One of the things that I find interesting is clinical trial design and market shaping, but there are lots of people here who are very interested in other areas, such as improving scientific funding. We should learn from what succeeded and failed. We should experiment and test new approaches, see if they actually work, and find better ways to implement them. I think there's still a lot of open questions, though, in this field. Should we work on the areas where there are cheap wins, or where there are large bottlenecks to many different fields of medical research? Should we only work on ideas that we're quite confident about, or ideas that have huge upsides, but also a lot of risk? Or maybe ideas like the ones that I've talked about, where there's an existing proof of concept example. I'm just going to go back to this. This is probably my favorite chart that I've made. And kind of think about how much more we have now than we did in the past. If you look at the 1950s, we only had around a dozen vaccines, and we now have around 30. A lot of them were vaccines that people thought were not possible to develop. The respiratory syncytial virus, for example, there was lots of research into clinical trials for it in the 1960s, and they decided to stop doing those trials because there were side effects seen in some of the children who received it. There was a lot of delay after that until there were some fundamental science breakthroughs that helped people design better vaccines. And we now have 3 RSV vaccines that were developed in just the last year. Similarly, we only have the Mpox or monkeypox vaccine because of basic science research. And actually, this vaccine didn't go through the regular clinical trial process. It was tested in monkeys, and based on immunological correlates, the US decided that we should have this vaccine in case there was an outbreak of smallpox or Mpox in the future. This is a very short illustrative summary of why I think this is important. If we look at the status quo of how many deaths are caused by any disease over time, you might see a growth rate like this, and then maybe we figured out some ways to prevent new deaths from the disease. If we have a slower breakthrough 10 years from now in developing a drug or vaccine against that disease, we save a certain number of lives. But if we do a faster breakthrough, we save a much larger amount of lives that is almost comparable to improving the efficacy of a drug. I think speeding up vaccination or speeding up the development of breakthroughs is one idea to make a lot of progress on an area that hasn't really been focused on so much so far. That's all I've got for now. I know there are a lot of people here with experience in this area and lots of ideas, and I want to hear from you as well. So thank you.